I now have the pleasure of introducing the moderator for our keynote panel. Born in the Dominican Republic, Daniel Padilla Peralta grew up undocumented in New York City. He graduated from Princeton with a BA in Classics, summa cum laude, and received an MPhil in Classics at Oxford before venturing out to the West Coast for a PhD in Classics from Stanford. After a 2-year stint as a Mellon Fellow and lecturer in Classics at Columbia, Daniel returned to Princeton as an assistant professor in the Classics department with affiliations to the university's programs in Latino Studies and Latin American Studies, as well as its Center for Human Values. A contributor to and editorial board member of the public-facing journal Eidolon, Daniel has published short pieces with The Guardian, Matter, Vox, The New York Times, and The Fabulist. His 2015 memoir, Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to Ivy League, received an Alex Award from the American Library Association. Please join me in offering a warm round of applause to all of our panelists.
I'll wait until the panelists sit down, and then I'll introduce them. Foreign-born but New York City bred, I am honored to be moderating this keynote panel, and I'm grateful to the team at Princeton Alumni Corps and Appleseed for extending the invitation. I'll introduce our three panelists by order of presentation, and each of them will chat with us for 10 to 15 minutes before we transition to Q&A. I'll begin with Laura Speer, who is Director of Strategy at the Annie E. Casey Foundation and who works with the senior leadership team to develop and implement the Foundation's vision of a brighter future for all young people in the United States. Prior to her current position, Laura had primary responsibility for the National Kids Count Project and managed a portfolio focused on national policy research and advocacy with a special emphasis on racial equity policy and policies impacting immigrant families. Having spent years doing state and local level child advocacy work, Laura served as a key resource for state advocates in the U.S., as well as several child advocates in Latin America interested in data-based advocacy. Laura is a member of the board of directors of the U.S.-Mexico Border Philanthropy Partnership, grantmakers concerned with immigrants and refugees, and WYPR Public Radio in Baltimore. Laura has a BA in economics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and a master's in public administration from New York University. Please join me in welcoming Laura. Batting second is Stephen Choi, who is executive director of the New York Immigrant Coalition, a coalition of nearly 200 member groups that represents New York State's immigrant communities. He has doubled the size of the organization's budget and staff, now overseeing the nation's largest state immigrant rights coalition and serving as New York's chief advocate on immigrant rights, education, civic participation, and healthcare access on the federal, state, and local levels. From 2009 to 2013, he was the executive director of the Min Kwon Center for Community Action, which represents the Korean and Asian community in New York. He received a JD from Harvard Law School, an MA from the University of Hawaii, and a BA from Stanford University in history with honors. West Coast, yeah. Mr. Choi also currently serves on the New York City Commission on Human Rights and on the board of the United Way of New York City. Please join me in welcoming Steve. And batting third, Sanaa Abrar, who's the advocacy director for United We Dream. She serves as the advocacy director at the nation's largest immigrant youth-led network. She was born in Pakistan and immigrated with her mother at 3 months old to reunite with her father in the United States. She manages and oversees United We Dream's policy and advocacy at the federal, state, and local levels, ensuring that the vision of immigrant youth of building thriving communities is centered, won, and implemented. Please join me in welcoming Sanaa. So without further ado, I kick it off to Laura, and I will sit down and bask in the glow.
Oh, I don't know about basking in the glow, but thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm honored and very happy to be here. I think the reason why I was invited to come and speak with you all is both to talk a little bit about the Casey Foundation, the Annie Casey Foundation's kind of our viewpoint on networks and why we think networks are important, but also to talk a bit more about the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, which we were one of the first funders of, and kind of share a little bit of that. But I'll say that I'm guessing most folks have some relationship with the Casey Foundation, or at least you hopefully listen to NPR. You heard that I was on the board of a local NPR affiliate, and therefore you have heard the Annie Casey Foundation on NPR. But we are based in Baltimore. We're a national foundation that is really focused very intentionally on children, on vulnerable children. But in the context of their families and the communities in which they live. And actually I was joking with Myra. She said all the stuff that I would have, she said a lot of stuff I didn't have in my notes, but I was like, that. I agree with everything that she said in terms of the fact that, we recognize the power of networks. We recognize the value of networks. There's, I was an economics major, so there is, economies of scale with networks in terms of creating technical assistance and being able to create common messaging and common themes. I mean, there's all kinds of good reasons to support networks. And we have supported lots of networks over the years. One of the most visible and longest term networks that we've supported is the Kids Count Network, which is, there's somebody doing Kids Count in every state, DC, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Most of these organizations have been in our network for 20 plus years. And so we have very long-term relationships with them. We've also been a long-time supporter of the State Priorities Partnership Network, which David's here representing the New York partner. Again, we've had long-standing relationships, which is rare for foundations. I think that's another piece of the puzzle, is that this is not a short-term, yes, there are campaigns that come and go, but building the longer-term relationship is really important and something that we've tried hard to do. I think the bottom line is that we know that no matter how good one organization is, how strategic, how well funded, the likelihood that they're actually going to be able to have impact and make big changes alone is very, very small. That all the things that we want to do require really a group of folks coming together and being aligned in their results. So I'm going to very quickly tell the story around the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, but I know that Elizabeth's here from CLASP. I think Sonia might be here from NILC. They will tell you much more about how it happens, the good stuff, the important stuff, the strategies, and the work that happened. What I was going to share is kind of our, as a funder, where we came into the conversation and kind of what I thought were some of the most biggest takeaways and most interesting things that happened as a result of that campaign. So as I said, we are a funder focused on children. We have placed a very high priority on equity. And back in 2016, we decided as part of that work that we needed to bring together some groups of folks to think through what's a common agenda, our common agenda around kids and immigrant families, thinking about it through an equity lens, thinking about the fact that 90% of kids in immigrant families are kids of color, 90% of kids in immigrant families are actually U.S. citizens. How are we thinking about what are the things that are the common agenda for, because they are the kids of the United States. I mean, you heard earlier about the percentage of people in New York that are immigrants. The percentage of kids who are in immigrant families is probably certainly higher than 60%. I don't know what the percentage is. Maybe someone in the room, Stephen? Anyway, so it's those are the kids. Those are our kids. And so thinking through how we think about not only what's the common agenda, but what are our aligned contributions, each of the organizations, whether it's a children's advocacy organization like First Focus, Bruce is here for that, or a racial equity organization, or a health advocacy organization or an educator, what are the aligned contributions around making sure that kids in immigrant families have the best opportunity to succeed and to be able to contribute to the country as they get older. So we brought a group of really, as another thing that Myra said, was the perch that we get to sit on when you're at a foundation is just so cool. You get to hear and talk and interact with and talk with folks who are just so smart and have such great, are really very inspirational. And so, but we brought a group of folks together. Folks from NILC and CLASP were in the room, along with a lot of other advocacy groups. And they, after that, we talked about the agenda setting, and a part of that was protecting families, from family separation, because although 90% of kids in immigrant families are citizens because they were born here, many have parents who are not or who are undocumented, but also what are the things that need to happen to make sure that they're successful educationally and that they're healthy? What are the things that need to happen to make sure that their families have access to the economic security that they need to be successful, that they're able to get good jobs? So this was in 2016. Then the election happened, and in January, among the many executive orders that came out at that time, within the first few days, really, of the new presidency, one of the orders that was leaked was the order around public charge and determination as changing the rules around how someone might get determined to be a public charge and would affect their immigration status. So again, I think Elizabeth and Sonia probably could talk more about the actual strategies, but the CLASP and NILC, after the National Immigration Law Center and the Center for Law and Social Policy, I shouldn't just use the acronyms, assuming everybody knows what that means, came together shortly after the meeting we had, but then after the public charge order was leaked, and said that, came together with a proposal to create a network around protecting immigrant families. And there was short-term and long-term goals set. Short-term around delaying the public charge orders from going into place and blocking them if possible, around combating the chilling effect that the administration was having on immigrant families accessing the things that they were eligible to get for their kids, important basic needs for their kids and families, and then setting a proactive vision for the future. So it was not just about the individual the individual public charge order, but that was the rallying point for that campaign. So long story short, there are about 300 organizations in that network right now. Many of your groups are probably in that network and probably participated in helping to get more than 100,000 comments that ended up getting submitted to the administration around the public charge rule changes. The kind of just a few lessons learned, because I'm probably the end of my time, right? I don't know.
We have time for a few lessons.
All right, a few lessons, 3. The first is really, to me, kind of look as an inside outsider. I mean, I was a little more than an outsider, but as looking into the campaign and in the final reckoning, the things that I think were most impressive were the fact, the value of allies and aligned contributions in this moment when the threats are so high, when people are in rapid response mode all the time, especially those who are working with immigrant families. This idea of creating a broader coalition of folks who can come in with the things that they are good at. If they're a research organization, come in and be able to provide research on what's the chilling effect in numbers that we see happening today, or if they are coming from the faith community, talking about the moral implications of these rules. The second is that and this is something Myra alluded to, is that what we heard when I went back and was talking with the staff at NILC in class, they really emphasized the fact that the folks in the 300 organizations in that coalition really appreciated the fact that there was two groups that had been funded to be the hub for this campaign. That's something that foundations don't often want to fund. We want to fund the people who are doing the legal services, or the people that are doing the working with immigrants, or on the Hill lobbying, well, not lobbying, you know what I mean, on the Hill talking with members of Congress and others. Strike that, yeah. I will. Nobody tell anybody that I work with that I said that. But funding that hub, that hub work is often not the most glamorous, but it's important, and more foundations need to be willing to do that. And then finally, just the last thing is around the value of having a short-term win, having a short-term goal to which people can contribute in a relatively easy way, and having a longer-term vision. Like having the short-term win, the win around, yes, the public charge rules might still change, but the fact that there were more than 100,000 comments that went in, people felt really good about that. And people had the ability, that's something over which you have some power to do something. And there's lots of things now where you just feel like you don't have your one thing is not going to make a difference. But I think that was valuable. Also with the longer term vision around what kind of a country do we want this to be? What are the things that we want to put in place so that our kids, who are kids in immigrant families, will be successful as adults in the longer run, is what will really make the difference. So I was very happy to talk about that. I think there are people in this room who are much more expert. Hopefully you guys can hear from later. But that's all I got.
Yay! All right. Thank you so much. That was great. On to Steve.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. And first, I would just say that I'm happy to share from my experience. I would ask that any insights or comments that I share be kept within these rooms. I don't want folks going out and saying, he called Cuomo a what? I tend to do that from time to time, so I just want to flag that. So I was thinking about this question about coalitions and networks. And I think the thing that I would say is that we are a coalition that runs coalitions. And also that coalitions can be fierce, but they can be fraught. They can be incredibly fierce, but they can also be very fraught. So let me unpack that a little bit. So a couple years ago, we did a strategic planning process, and we actually said, who are we as the New York Immigration Coalition? And we realized a couple things that we're not. We are a coalition of about 200 member agencies all across New York State, anywhere from Brentwood, Long Island, working with Central American refugees, all the way to Buffalo, New York, working with Somali and Nepalese refugees, and every sort of immigrant community in between. And so there are a couple things that we are not. There's organizations that are out there that call themselves a coalition, but they're not. They're single organizations that sort of operate on their own. And there's a power and a value to that. Decision making can be very quick. You can take a position, you can move it quickly, you can figure out where the consequences can fall, because it's going to fall in one organization. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have a federation or a trade association that may have an elected a leader. And those are different as well. They have the power of sort of this buy-in and this democracy where folks really feel like they have a say in where that federation, what it actually advocates for. But they can be very cumbersome, to be totally frank. And also they can tend to be a little bit myopic at times, right? They might be fighting just for their own self-interest and not necessarily for the broader self-interest of the community. So when we thought about who it is that we were as the New York Immigration Coalition, we came down on the side of being a coalition, which is sort of in the middle. We have 200 member agencies that there's a certain level of accountability to them. About half of our board comes from member agencies. And so we do our part to represent our member agencies, but we also reserve the flexibility to say, you know what, this issue, like driver's licenses, might not directly affect the member agencies that we call our members, but are really critical to move the movement forward. And so that was a very conscious and intentional decision that we made. We are a true coalition, but we're not a federation. We're not a trade association, and we're not an organization that calls themselves just a coalition. So the coalitional aspect of this, it's something that's baked into our DNA, and we believe in it deeply. All of our work, essentially, is done through coalitions, and I think Laura laid out exactly why those are powerful. The ability to bring together all sorts of different stakeholders, different communities from across the state that are all aligned around one particular goal and one mission, that's actually really powerful. And without that, and this is something that I remind our folks all the time, without that, we're just lobbyists in a midtown office in midtown Manhattan. And what kind of real power do we have in that case? You know, I'm reminded of that specifically because of the governor, speaking of the governor. You know, in the aftermath of the Trump election, we call that an aftermath, 2 weeks after that, Governor Cuomo, you know, his general counsel gave me a call and said, you know, the governor's going to be making a major announcement tomorrow. This was Saturday night at 1 a.m. That's how the governor does business. And he said he's going to make a major announcement the next morning, and he's going to announce the Liberty Defense Project. And I was like, that's great. That is wonderful. What does that mean? Well, we got to figure out the details later. If you fast forward 6 months later, there were still no details, and the state budget was about to get set. And so we had sort of been in this rapid response moment, and immediately that kicked into gear. And some of the tools that we use as an organization, our ability to reach the media, our ability to use social media, those were the things, you know, to be able to use resources to get out there. And so we started to attack the governor. And, you know, I went on NPR, I went on Brian Lehrer's show, I did all these media appearances, and you know, I used all of the governor's like choice quotes, and he's used, you know, back in November when he announced this Liberty Defense Project, he said, if there's a move to deport immigrants, this is my Andrew Cuomo voice. He said, if there's a move to deport immigrants, they can start with me. I'm the grandson. And basically, I, as an individual, and we as an organization, called him out on that. And then what ended up happening was a big battle with the governor's office. And the governor used the fact that we sort of were a little bit over our skis, and that we hadn't taken the time and the effort to really bring all of our organizations with us to that fight. And so he started to actually talk to other organizations and say, basically, oh, you know, the Steve Choi guy and the New York Immigration Coalition, you guys are a member, but you don't really agree with what's going on. He was actually trying to organize his own coalition against us. And so what ended up was a very fraught, very explosive, difficult conversation. Ultimately, we were able to get $10 million for the Liberty Defense Project, but it was a searing, scorched earth battle. And afterwards, the reflection that we had was, it's critical for us not to ever forget the fact that we have to be accountable to our members, and our strength is with our members. So if you fast forward 2 years to this year, just a couple weeks ago, we were again in a big battle with the governor's office and with the legislature. And this time he was talking about eliminating funding for the Liberty Defense Project, which is the only source of immigration legal services funding in New York State that's provided by the state. Imagine that. In this Trump era, they're talking about eliminating immigration legal services funding. But this time, we remembered what had happened and how much we had been burned 2 years ago. And actually, at this point, we had created something called the Immigrant Leaders Council, a sort of coalition within our coalition. And so this time, when we said, you know, Governor Cuomo, this is unacceptable, you need to get on a call with us, but not with me, with our Immigrant Leaders Council. And we had specifically taken the time to be able to bring together 15 groups that represented groups in Long Island, Westchester and the Hudson Valley, Buffalo and Erie County. And they were the ones who were on the call, and the power that they brought to that call was undeniable. And so the dynamic was completely different. Instead of the council, instead of myself being on a call with, you know, the counsel to the governor and us calling each other names, it was a very different dynamic, and there was a recognition of the power that we were bringing. And I think really sort of validated for us, you know, there are going to be moments where we need to move quickly, where we need to make executive decisions, but we need to create this coalitional structures that allow us to do that and have real buy-in from our members. Because if we don't do that, we are just paid lobbyists in some kind of office. That's not where our power lies. And so the fierceness of the coalitions that we can bring together are incredibly powerful. They're also very fraught. And the reason I say this, and folks who have been involved in coalitions, as many of you have, you understand, for us at any given moment in any coalition we're working with, we have to balance the needs and concerns of our member agencies, the constituents they represent, our staff, and our board, all of whom have different interests, different concerns. And so that's just within our organization. But when we are working in coalition with other organizations, that becomes incredibly more fraught because now you're dealing with organizational ego. You're dealing with funding. You're dealing with attention from from elected officials. And that incredibly complicates that particular conversation. So as we're moving coalitions forward, the idea of decision making. How do coalitions make decisions? What's the decision-making mechanism? Who's actually leading it? What does it mean for us to lead? And what is our accountability to our coalitions? And what is their roles and responsibilities? If you don't spend the time to sort of unpack that from the get-go, then you can end up in real trouble. And I'll give you an example. Earlier this year, last year, we had created a statewide coalition called New York Counts 2020. Because of all the challenges that we saw for immigrant communities in New York that the census was posing for us, but not just for immigrants. It was really a much broader coalition. And so we launched a state advocacy campaign for New York Counts 2020, where we were working with a coalition. And our ask was $40 million for the state to invest in census funding. And at the governor's executive budget, I always talk about the governor, but he's like a very easy foil. But he put in $0 in his executive budget. And we said, okay, we need to fight for $40 million. And actually, David Kallick and FPI were very central in sort of coming up with that figure, $40 million. And so we had this big fight. We're working with a coalition. We're organizing lobby days. And at the end of the day, literally hours before the state budget is finalized, our legislative allies to that point had been saying, you guys got it, 40 million is good, we're there. Literally hours before that, on a Saturday night at 7 p.m., I got a text from one of the elected officials saying, oh no, he cut it to $20 million, he meaning the governor. And at that point, we have a decision to make. Number one, how are we going to respond to that? And number two, what is our substantive position going to be? And we had to bring together our coalition immediately. We had created the steering committee, and so we had to bring them together and say, at this moment, at the 11th hour, what's going to be our stance? Are we going to go out there and just blast the governor and say this is absolutely unacceptable, $20 million is unacceptable, we're asking for $40 million? And we had a real conversation. There were some folks who were raring to go, as in any coalition, raring to take folks on and to call people out. And then there are other folks, particularly outside of New York City, in Long Island, in upstate, who are like, you know what? $20 million is a win. And so we had a very intentional conversation at the steering committee level where we said, let's remind ourselves, who is actually going to make this decision? Is it the steering committee? Is it us as the NYC, as the leaders of that, coming to you all with a recommendation? And how are we going to make sure that we're taking into account the interests of communities like those in Long Island and upstate who are going to say, I can't agree with the central message if you're going to go out there and blast the governor on this? So the fraughtness of coalitions is something that I think sort of gets swept under the rug because people don't like to talk about it. But if we aren't intentional about decision-making processes and who is actually calling the shots from the get-go, then coalitions can run into problems. One more final thing that I would say before we get into sort of the lessons that I want to sort of leave folks with. It's different in the Trump era. And I think it's different for groups that, like ours, that we sort of identify ourselves as part of the resistance. Because we are in a different moment now where there's so much outrage, there's so much anger, and there's so many people who are willing to throw down with you that it's an incredibly powerful, seductive tool to be able to engage those allies, but you have to be careful. Laura mentioned all the executive orders that came down in the first week of this president's presidency. I generally don't like to use his name, so number 40, the president. So as folks remember, the Muslim ban happened on Friday. He signed that into law Friday, 4:42 p.m., basically stopping immigration and really travel coming from 6 Muslim-majority countries. That was on a Friday, January 27th. Literally that night, we started to hear that people were being detained at JFK. And the next morning, we heard that dozens of people were being detained at JFK Airport, which was unfathomable. And so, we put up a Facebook post, other people put up Facebook posts saying, we need to mobilize, everybody needs to go to JFK because there's something so fundamentally un-American about this idea that we're detaining people at JFK, that we're detaining people and sending them back to their home countries just because they're Muslim. And hundreds of people started to go out. And this is, if you can imagine, a cold, wintry January Saturday, and hundreds of people start to come out. And I remember the governor's office, they got me on the phone with Pat Foy, who runs the Port Authority, who runs JFK. And I'll never forget this. He said, don't worry about it, Steve. We got this under control. There's less than 100 people. And I was like, Pat, you are so wrong. There are hundreds of people coming to JFK. There might be thousands. And more people start to go there. And by the time I showed up there that night at like 7 p.m. on a Saturday, there were literally thousands of people there. And the energy and the sentiment that I felt there was unbelievable. Something I'd never seen before, where people were chanting and singing and just saying, immigrants are welcome here. Muslims are welcome here. It was a sight that I'd never seen before. And, I remember we talked with our allies, and it was amazing that that folks were mobilized to come to JFK. I mean, think about how amazing that is. Thousands of people went to JFK of their own accord. Nobody goes to JFK unless that's really amazing that they did that. And we talked with our allies and we said there's so much energy and enthusiasm. We need to have an action tomorrow in 12 hours. And this is something that we had never done before. And so, we got up, we announced this, and then I got up down. It was like 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, and I called Bita's colleagues over at the mayor's office, and I said, I know that usually it takes weeks to get a permit to do an event, but we're going to have an event tomorrow in about 12 hours, just to let you know. And they were like, well, how many people do you expect? And I was like, it could be 500, it could be 5,000. And they were like, it's going to be hard to get a permit like that. The next day, we had this action at Battery Park City, and 20,000 people showed up. And it was something that we'd never seen. And usually before that, I remember back in 2014, we organized this huge march, and we spent months organizing, and we got like 4,000 people. So the idea that we could mobilize more than 20,000 people just through a Facebook post or a Twitter post was something that we had never imagined. And so in the weeks and months after that, we started to do that. We would call for an action. When DACA was canceled, we called for an action literally with a Twitter post that morning, and we called for people to come out, and 10,000 people showed up at Foley Square. But the thing is you can get dependent upon that. You can get dependent on the fact that allies, many of them who are not immigrants, that a lot of white allies who now see themselves in the fight will come out to your actions, but you can't get defined by that. And I think a lot of times we start to get defined by that. We start to say, we can just pull together an action in 6 hours, just do a Twitter post and a Facebook post. But we sort of were ignoring the bread and butter of the day in and day out organizing of diverse immigrant communities that we are all about. And so that is one of the central challenges during this Trump era. How do you balance the fact that we now have an incredibly powerful megaphone that's able to reach tens of thousands of people and mobilize them for action, but not also forget about the fact that we are in a coalition at the end of the day that is really accountable to our member agencies that are immigrants and people of color. And so that is one of the central challenges. So, as we go into the roundtables, a couple things that I would just say to wrap up. One, being intentional about decision-making processes. Every time we rush into action as a coalition, we don't spend that time. And it's easy to do so because the work needs to get done. But every time that we don't spend that time being intentional about decision-making processes within the coalitions that we run, it always bites us in the butt. And so being intentional about that from the get-go is critical. Number two, in this Trump era, thinking about how you balance the fact that so many of our organizations are now armed with incredibly powerful megaphones to allies. And how do you balance that with the networks that you already have? One of the central challenges that we have today. There was another really great insight that I'm struggling to remember right now. Oh, it's this. Nowadays, particularly when you're working in mixed political states or mixed political environments, you need coalitions. We can pass things in New York State. I can go out tomorrow and say we're going to pass a New York City Council resolution standing up for the rights of immigrants. Every council member, save a handful, will want to sign on to that. It's a very different political environment in Albany and in New York State, where frankly being pro-immigrant is not popular outside of New York City. So how do you get things done in New York State? How do you get things done in places like Nebraska or Iowa or Wisconsin or some of these mixed political states? Coalitions are necessary there, and you're going to need to bring together people who stand on very different sides of the ideological spectrum, but it's necessary in today's day and age.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And now we turn it over to Sanaa.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It is such a pleasure to be here. Want to, again, echo thanks to the Princeton Alumni Corps, to Appleseed, and Ford for hosting us. It has been amazing hearing you all speak. Laura, we were close thought partners at United We Dream with you all, and appreciate hearing your insights. And Stephen, you and the work that you're doing along with the New York advocates and organizers in the room is so appreciated, particularly as you are setting a bold vision in New York State for what is actually possible. And for thinking often beyond what's possible. So appreciate the inspiration that you're providing for localities throughout the nation and within New York State. So everyone, my name is Sanaa Abrar. I serve as the Advocacy Director at United We Dream, the nation's largest immigrant youth-led network. I was born in Karachi, Pakistan, and I grew up in Kentucky. I often say Karachi born, Kentucky raised. And some of you might be able to imagine what that experience was like growing up as a proud, fierce, brown, Muslim, Pakistani girl in the South. I hold on to my Southern roots, and even though I'm based in DC for the moment, I do plan to continue doing organizing and policy work in the South, particularly with communities of color. And that's where networks and coalitions come in quite a bit. I can't stress enough how important it is to come from that background for me in my daily work. It means I see racism for what it is. I dealt with the Islamophobic slurs coming up through school, at some points internalizing it and thinking that this is the reality for someone like me who's living in a place like this. But that was not the truth, particularly as I started learning more about the fact that there were people out there who look like me, who have similar stories, who have completely different stories, who were organizing as youth of color, not only in rural areas, but throughout the country, nationwide. And so for what I wanted to share today actually was to talk about the bold ideas that we bring to networking, not only outside of United We Dream and the coalitions in which we work in, but also within United We Dream. Our full name is the United We Dream Network. We were started out as a network, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and how it works in current day within United We Dream. I also wanted to talk to you about a particular coalition that we are involved with as co-chairs, the Defund Hate Coalition, and what that has meant for us, particularly within this current presidential administration. And finally, I wanted to address with you all, the big picture thinking about what we can do with networks and how they continue to build out across the issue movements, if that makes sense. Yes, we're focusing on immigration, forced migration today, but what we do and what other movements are doing outside of the immigration movement have incredibly clear impacts for the everyday work that we're doing. And I wanted to be sure to note that in how I was addressing you all today. So, United We Dream. We are an immigrant youth-led network. That is a testament to our origins back in 2008, when we kind of formed as a conglomeration of organizations based throughout the country, from right here in New York to Texas to Florida to California. Undocumented youth in 2008 saw a vacuum when it came to policy at the federal level, and were impassioned when it came to implementing the lessons that they had been learning at the state and local level into what was happening at the federal level at the time. And that's me kind of referring to the immigration reform debates that were happening between 2006, 2008. So what does that mean now for us being a network? So I'll let you in on, it's not really a secret, but a lot of folks don't know about kind of a part of the United We Dream magic is what we call the NLC, or the National Leadership Council. Or I should say National Leadership Committee. The NLC is made up of about 15 to 20 immigrant youth from throughout the country who we convene to help guide us in our decision-making process. Now, don't get me wrong, as advocacy director and with my boss, Cristina Jimenez, the executive director, Gresa Martinez Rosas, our deputy executive director, we share our own expertise, our recommendations, our suggestions. But the real magic about convening this group is that they're not policy experts. These are not individuals who are going to Capitol Hill on a day-to-day basis. These are individuals who are making ends meet. Moms, dads, individuals who are in school, who are working one or multiple jobs, individuals who, for them, when we convene, they have to take a huge step back, take in the information that we provide them, and ultimately come to a decision and help us kind of get a temperature check of where the read is in the room. And these are immigrant youth who are from throughout the country, whether we're talking about New York to Texas. We have folks in Oklahoma, Florida, California, Washington State. We are also taking a temperature check, not just of immigrant youth, but immigrant youth based on the geographic diversity and the different political realities that they're facing. Now, with my job, I am often in these rooms on Capitol Hill, and it's not enough for me to lay out the policy, lay out the statistics, and say, this is what we want. The magic that I aim to bring to these one-on-ones with members of Congress, with their staff, is, well, Serena in Oklahoma, who leads the DREAM Act Oklahoma organization there, has been talking to me about the direct impacts of this specific policy in the DREAM Act and how it would expand education access nationwide. She knows this because of her interactions with Oklahoma youth who are fighting for education equity in Oklahoma. For example, right? Being able to provide those real stories of the people who either are organizing or are making ends meet, or what's often the case, are doing everything at the same time. One specific example that I remember was in the DREAM Act 2017 fight, we had a big choice to make. The elections had just happened and we were getting ready for a reintroduction of the DREAM Act. And we had a choice to make of deciding, are we going to reintroduce the same language from previous years? Is this really a place where we can expand the policy and who is actually eligible for relief from deportation under this bill? And those questions obviously came with their different pros and cons answers. And it ultimately became a decision that we had to take to the NLC. Because we knew that at both the local, state, and federal levels, individuals were fighting many, many fights on the ground. We had to, first of all, get buy-in from folks that they were ready for another DREAM Act fight, particularly under this administration. And we had to get buy-in from folks on understanding, is this the bill that you will fight for? Is this the bill that you can knock doors on and recruit folks to take that bus ride across the country to Washington, D.C.? And I'm really pleased at how that conversation went with our NLC. They said, let's fight bigger. Let's be bolder. We're not just going to introduce the same old DREAM Act. One of the biggest changes that we were able to make with the introduction of DREAM 2017 was actually expanding eligibility and raising the age of individuals who initially came to the United States. Historically, the age has been, if you came before the age of 16, you are eligible if you fulfill certain criteria. We were able to push it up to if you came before the age of 18. Now, they might just be numbers, but the number of individuals, particularly within our network, who suddenly saw a light at the end of the tunnel of, oh, this thing that I've been fighting for, this thing that I've heard my friends advocating for, I actually qualify. Talking to members of the NLC, our staff and members, and walking them through the policy and seeing their faces light up and say, oh, so this is a bill for me too, right? And that's not to challenge, they had been advocating for this. This was their life. This was their brothers, their sisters, their friends, their family members. But there was a clear understanding for many individuals in our network who came after the cutoff age, who said, this is something that could be a reality for me in a landscape where we could get this bill passed. And so I think, thinking about the DREAM Act fight of 2017, there were a lot of late night conversations. There were a lot of updates coming out of the Senate, of the House, and particularly the White House. And I mean, frankly, we kept in consistent contact with our folks on the NLC, doing those 11 p.m. calls, making sure that the times worked out for the West Coast people and the East Coast people. It's something as little as scheduling. I know that might sound a little, I don't know what the word is right now, but a little kind of like, is that really important? But it truly has been important in the work that we've done. But bigger than that, the work of centering directly impacted voices through that committee has been hugely impactful for us. So now to coalitions. I want to take a step back from the DREAM Act and recognize something. There has not been proactive, relief-centered immigration reform in this country for decades. And when I say that, I mean reform that will provide folks pathway to citizenship. But there has been a consistency on another side, which is the consistent increasing of funds, resources, and money for immigration enforcement agencies. That has been a status quo. This is happening every single year. The deportation force continues to grow, and individuals continue to remain in undocumented limbo. And so we often call it annual enforcement-only immigration reform. But in this administration, we have been seeing quite a bit of the White House trying to use this enforcement lens to also offer, in exchange, relief for others. And at that, we have honestly been saying, hell no to that. Because we understand that using things like the DREAM Act, the Dream and Promise Act, relief for some folks without relief for others, and in exchange, increasing funds for the deportation force is incredibly harmful. We're talking about folks who might get relief from deportation from themselves, but their parents continue to be undocumented, their neighbors continue to be undocumented, and are under the eye of agencies like ICE and Border Patrol that have been responsible for ages for the separation of families throughout our country. And so we know that Washington has run on this consistency of building up the deportation force, and we have often been kind of this stopgap, not only to Republicans, but to Democrats as well, when they pitch reforms that couple relief with more funding and more resources. And this is such an old idea. This isn't just during this administration, right? CIR, comprehensive immigration reform, we've stopped using that word, to be quite frank with you all, because it brings up these old, frankly outdated notions of we need to give to some and frankly put fear and terrorize more communities in exchange. We need enforcement decreases and not increases. And this was a, I don't want to call it revolutionary, but it was a revolutionary idea that we took into action through the coalition that we co-chair with the Detention Watch Network called the Defund Hate Coalition. And I remember our first meeting about 2 years ago when it was a smattering of 7 to 8 orgs kind of like, okay, so we're doing this. We're gonna do this. We're gonna ask for this in this right now. Can we wait? No, let's not wait. Let's do it now. And I remember my sense of it was, we're gonna make appropriations sexy. It's gonna be the thing that people are talking about. We're gonna be talking about cutting funds, but more than that, we're gonna talk about the human impacts of what it means to cut funds, to take from immigration enforcement. What does it mean to actually invest in communities, to provide healthcare access, to provide driver's licenses for all, instead of thinking of new ways to insert agents, law enforcement, border militarization into communities that are particularly dominated by communities of color and undocumented immigrants. And we're proud to co-chair this coalition. We have been able to double the size in the past 2 years. We're at about 26 organizations. And one of my clear memories of the work that we've been able to do is just this past February, during the longest government shutdown in history, I was able to witness 3 families who had personally experienced either the detention or the deportation of one of their family members, standing on Capitol Hill at a press event, alongside progressive multi-issue groups who have been a part of the coalition, groups like Move On and Indivisible, with faith groups, with environmental justice groups, with immigrant rights groups, and with them a clear mark of what one of our successes has been, which is building champions, the squad, so to speak, of New York's own Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, all speaking truth to power about what does it mean to actually cut funds? What does it mean to recognize that generally Americans, taxpayers, do they really want to contribute to building more detention camps? Do they really want to contribute to separating more families and taking loved ones away? And the answer, at least the one that we have been pushing and educating folks about, is no. To kind of wrap up, I wanted to share in terms of the broader movement dynamics and thinking about the cross-issue work that we want to do, that we are trying to do, and that we are actively doing. Is, after the elections, my boss, Christina, got a call from Cecile Richards at Planned Parenthood. This was a day after the elections, and she said, "We're with you. What do you need? We're there for you." And that's only a small example of what we experienced at United We Dream, very similar to what Stephen was talking through, of this huge outpouring of support. We want to help the youth. We want to support the immigrant youth. What can we do? That actually pushed us to create what's called the Here to Stay Network, which is an online network, email listserv, online platform where folks who wanted to do something are now called to action through text updates to go to this action, to let them know if they happen to have there's a deportation case in their own neighborhood, to say this person has just been detained. You can go to the local ICE field office and advocate for their release. I think what we have to understand is that when we're talking about immigration, we're also talking about many of the same villains or the same agitators who are doing a ton of other terrible things in this country, and we have to recognize that and understand how we can build out networks outside of the classic immigration spaces. Of course, there's a sense of we need to keep unity within our movement, but also we need to look outside and who are those folks, who are the players outside of our network who are suddenly waking up to the fact that there's a problem, right? The same folks who are pushing for the shutting down of detention camps are also, frankly, a lot of the same people who are pushing back against private prison companies that are incarcerating Black and brown men and women every single day. The same people who are in favor of ripping children away from mothers, fathers, family members, caretakers are also trying everything they can do to restrict a woman's right to abortion. The same people who are in favor of workplace raids are, frankly, a lot of the same people who are anti-collective bargaining. It's making those creative connections and also learning from other movements, looking at the Sunrise Movement, another youth-led movement, and their tactics and their strategy, and also taking some of their language, walking into rooms and saying, yes, we want the Dream and Promise Act, and we want more. We're not stopping. We're going to be bold, because we're also seeing a lot of the attention and the champions building work that groups and issue advocates around Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, and so many other issues are doing and able to build up in this day and age, right, under this administration. And I think that's truly revolutionary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm brimming with questions for our panelists, but it's appropriate at this stage to cede the floor to y'all to see what questions you might have for our panel. So if anyone is game and willing, please make yourself known. We have microphones. We have index cards. We have many technologies that you can use. You got one? Yes. All right.
No worries. I just got here about.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm a P55 fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you all for speaking. I've been a journalist and activist in my past life, and now in the philanthropy side, which is an entirely different vantage point. So, question for, I guess, for a funder, but all of you, when Trump was elected, there was a certain infectious impetus and solidarity for everyone to organize around it. Rockefeller Foundation gave a donation to ACLU and the IRC, for example. We've lost that on a national stage to some degree, especially around the more traditional, historical, bigger foundations. And so what are your tips for especially someone who's perhaps a little earlier on in their career to being able to kind of inspire that sort of passion on teams where everyone believes in those shared values of equity and diversity, but isn't necessarily realized because of a history that is perhaps a little more averse to change and organizing, if that makes sense.
Oh boy, that question's for me, I guess, huh? Or anybody. You guys should jump in. You probably have better ideas than I do from being I've been at this foundation now for 15 years. So, however, I totally agree with and it's an important point. The point around the fact that there was a lot of foundations who stepped up in the last 2 years who had never funded big around the immigrant rights movement generally, or healthcare advocacy, or you name it, because the threats were so great, and that money is gone for the most part. That's the reality of the situation. The threat is not gone. And so it's a real concern that I have as somebody who participated in going to my board and saying, we need more money. Give us, this is a terrible threat in this moment. Please, can we use some of our endowment in this moment to provide some funds to kind of stop the potential harm from happening? And we got it from them, which is good. So I'd say, for one, we tried to be very transparent with the people who we gave grants to that this was in fact not a long-term funding. This was a one-time commitment from the board. We didn't know what the future commitment was going to look like. You should expect to receive this money in that way. I know I worked at nonprofits, I went to foundations, I know how it works. You get your foot in the door once and you're like, oh, maybe I can get, even though they said it was only one time, I'm going to ask them again, and they liked what I did, and that could be the case, but I think, I know. But, being transparent, but also thinking through where there are opportunities to connect with other funders, like Myra said, to be able, people who might be able to pick up funding where you're not able to. And I think in as much as there's an opportunity to kind of switch the conversation around, this is about achieving our results as a foundation. If we want to achieve results for kids in America, we have to be thinking about immigrant issues, immigration issues, and language access issues. Those are the kids in America. So, that's what certainly we try to do within kind of internal advocacy within the foundation, which happens. So if you guys have any thoughts on that front?
The one thing that I would say is that in this sort of like Trump moments, there has been an incredible amount of attention, money, resources that is trying to get to organizations that often are the least equipped to actually handle that,
Yeah.
right? When you think about all the organizations, and I think about our member organizations on the ground, a lot of them are staffed by first generation, non-English speaking folks who are working day in and day out with communities. They're not focused on how do you use social media and how do you do like a CrowdRise thing or online a Facebook fundraiser. They're not thinking about those things. And so that to me is the great danger that what I think is a positive, that funders have been willing to step forward and say, in this moment, we're going to amp up our giving. We're going to really think about this. And other folks, as I mentioned earlier, allies have been really seeing themselves as part of the fight. But is the field really equipped to be able to handle that? And we're still there, but we're sort of on the tail end now. And I think there really needs to be a major sort of investment and an approach that says, how are we actually going to get some of these organizations, make sure that they are actually equipped to deal with volunteers, that they are thinking about online fundraising, that they're actually thinking about creating more sort of sustainable practices and being able to catch some of those folks who are coming across and saying, I want to donate money to Chaya CDC that works with the South Asian community in Jackson Heights. Or I want to donate money to MASA working with Mexican communities in the Bronx. Is Chaya and MASA, how are we thinking about ways that they're going to be able to hold on to those folks and really be able to use them for the long term? Because this wave is cresting, there's no doubt about it. And I think that is really going to be something that's going to be critical for the long-term sustainability. Are we going to be able to make those investments so that groups will be able to really leverage that for long-term impact?
The scepter of speech is over there now.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Monica Vargas Huertas, and I work with the Leo Education Fund. I applaud what Sanaa was mentioning about doing a real immigration reform. Let's stop talking about the comprehensive immigration reform that was talking for so many years. But my question is, how do you think we can convey like these more progressive ideas, more inclusive towards other immigrants and not just the dreamers? I'm saying, for instance, yesterday I was reading on the news that this House of Representatives bill, bipartisan bill, that is pushing for finally open a path for 2 million of dreamers, but at the same time increasing the opportunity to strengthen the possibilities for residents to become citizens based on their immigrant records. So I would like to know how could we work together to make sure that this American dream and the path for citizenship is open for all?
That's a great question. And I would invite, I think this is a question that I think many folks are thinking about in this moment, particularly as we know that, for example, the new Democratic majority has its sights set on introducing what is the next phase of immigration reform in this country. So there are a lot of stakeholders, right, not just within like the political establishment that want to create something new and visionary, but there are folks all around in this room and beyond who are pushing for beyond this dreamer narrative, right? So one thing that, one part of this incremental change in terms of the narrative around who is deserving or who merits pathway to citizenship, or if you get right down to it, relief from deportation, is, for example, the Dream and Promise Act. I think we made a strategic decision with partners in the TPS space, particularly folks like the Painters Union, UndocuBlack Network, many of the unions that have within their cohort TPS holders, that ultimately it seemed a little, nearsighted to push for another DREAM Act of 2019 that was just focused on immigrant youth in light of the consistent attacks that have not just come upon immigrant youth, but TPS and DED holders. And, that's not even mentioning the whole swath of folks who have nothing, right, who are completely undocumented. So in a strategic decision to push for incremental change, we took the historic decision to expand what the DREAM Act means. Yeah. And that's the Dream and Promise Act, right? It doesn't cover everyone, obviously, but it would cover up to 2.5 million individuals, including immigrant youth and TPS and DED holders. One of the strategies there has been, let's break off from this dreamer narrative and let's push for pathway to citizenship, particularly on the end of TPS holders who don't resemble like immigrant youth. I mean, there are immigrant youth within the TPS population. I don't want to ignore those folks, but the TPS holders tend to be older folks, tend to be, many of them non-English speakers, tend to be folks who have been in this country for a very, very long time, who have built up businesses, families, and have U.S. citizen children and grandchildren, right? And there is a narrative there that has not completely been tapped into. The Dream and Promise Act has been a tactic through which we have been able to help the general public understand that there are many facets of the undocumented community. And we also see the Dream and Promise Act as a springboard to immigration reform that is inclusive of everyone, right? We're getting closer to that through the Dream and Promise Act by being able to talk about the many mixed status families, not only including U.S. citizen children, but mixed status in the sense that there are undocumented folks in these families. And I don't want to be unfair to your question. I know I'm not answering it comprehensively, but I want to just note that that is one of the many incremental tactics that we can be taking through the policy side, right, to talk about this idea of pathway to citizenship and how in our history it has been so merit-based. It has been so much in terms of what do I give to this country or this city or this state in order to be deserving of not being deported and separated from my family. We're here to challenge that, and we welcome the feedback and the ideas and the collective work of others who are like-minded in that sense and pushing beyond, pushing a little farther, right?
We have time for one more question, and it came via index card form, unless, this is a tough call. All right, I'll take it. All right.
Okay.
The index card has been deferred.
I feel very Game of Thrones-ish. Who do we choose? This is a complicated question, Sanaa, who I have the pleasure of working with very often in her genius brain. How do we expand our narrative into very large, very complicated, very controversial ideas, such as the fact that these waves of asylees and refugee seekers are not going to go down? They're going to increase because of climate change, which everyone sort of glazes over when I mention that word, like too big. And how do we work on binational and continental connections, which I feel are a gap, or I think maybe we all feel are a little bit of a gap within our movement, and that coordination while not diminishing the immediate needs of the populations here stateside, and realizing that the policies that we implement here have ramifications around the world. Very easy question.
Super easy.
In 1 minute.
Well, on the first piece, Sandra, I feel like you should be up here particularly for that second question, because Families Belong Together has been doing great work binationally. But I'm sure you'll address that in your panel. Everyone go to Sandra's panel. But on the first piece, I'll answer, one thing that's really come up for us is there has been, how should I say this? So nationalism is a weird thing. Borders are weird. They're constructed. They're not real. I'm just going to say that here and be very clear about that. That is my personal and professional opinion. And however, we see that there have been often splits in identity when it comes to members of our own or undocumented communities that have been here in the United States, and how they view more recent folks who are coming in as asylum seekers, as refugees. And I think to start, one piece that I've been thinking about and that we have to do at United We Dream because of our position not only on, universal access to relief from deportation and cutting funds to ICE and Border Patrol is that we have to educate our own communities about the similarities in not only background and stories, but the fact that it is on us, particularly as individuals who have gone through not necessarily the same situation, but the struggle of coming into this country, of living in limbo, of not necessarily being welcomed upon first coming here. We have to educate our communities that is something very similar that is happening right now as we speak, with folks coming who are fleeing climate change disaster, fleeing poverty, fleeing violence, and coming to the border. I say this carefully just because I have witnessed, I have heard, I've seen the individuals who have said things like, "Why are they coming here? They're going to ruin it for the rest of us," or "We're not going to get pathway to citizenship because more are coming," right? These are undocumented individuals. These are immigrants. These are youth. These are parents. And I'm sure some of you have heard similarly. And it's remarkable how the time spent in a country or your own history within these borders can completely change your frame of mind, particularly when we get into this very dangerous and often violent us versus them mentality. I'll let Steve go. I don't want to take over too much time.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, there is this resistance like, oh, well, people really like that if we start talking about binationally, international stuff. Like, I think when you talk about that, people's eyes also glaze over. They're like, there's no way we could do that. I actually think it's critical that we talk about this as sort of like this global journey, as this global story. Because honestly, I think one of the central problems that we grapple with is that, and there's been a lot of research on the fact that if you look at support for immigrants and immigration, it's like a mile wide and like an inch deep. And that's the reality, right? People will throw down about certain things, and a lot of progressives will talk about throwing down for immigration. They often don't. And I think that's one of the central challenges is it's something that you guys face. Immigration is something that you guys face. That's something for you guys, your community. But it's not. Right? When you think about the huge population of folks who are here, unless you came here in chains or you were a Native American, everybody is coming. And people say that in sort of a trite way. But unless we start to unpack that and think about that and get people to reflect, I think this is one of the great challenges in the projects that we have to do. We've got to get people to reflect a little bit more about their family's journey and their family's history and really make those connections with what's going on right now. Of course, there are differences. But I find that, when we talk to people and we ask them to reflect about their family's history and to do some research and to think about that, it puts their sort of perspective in a little bit of a different framework. And I think that's a challenge we need to do because at the end of the day, immigration cannot be something that you all are doing or those people are doing. It's got to be something that we all feel, including people who are like third generation, folks who consider third generation who consider themselves white for all matters, right? But unless you are actually thinking about yourself as an immigrant, as a third or fourth or fifth generation immigrant, you are going to be thinking about yourself as an us versus them thing. Even if you're a liberal and you're thinking, well, I really have a lot of sympathy for those folks there. But if you're not connecting it to you and your direct family experience, then at the end of the day, that sort of us versus them dynamic will always be there. So I think we have to be thinking about things from a global perspective and get people to think about their own family's journey coming from wherever it is that they're coming from and really sort of intertwine that within the immigration debate.
And I just want to add one quick thing. In terms of a concrete example of like, okay, we educated our people, what's next, right? So coming from a advocacy and policy perspective, we just had a recent win in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we had individuals in our New Mexico Dream team, which is a chapter of United We Dream, and the faith community partnered together in Albuquerque to fight for about $250,000 of funding passed by the city council there that all goes to assisting and helping recent folks who have arrived from the border, namely folks who are seeking asylum, refugees, because it was responding to the crisis that was happening, which was folks on a volunteer basis, including from our chapter, were going off on weekends to shelters, to taking clothing donations, bringing food to individuals who had absolutely nothing. Because we all know the government is doing very, very little when it comes to these folks who are arriving at the border, except for detaining them, right, in these horrific conditions. And so there are things that can be done in coalition as networks, not only the community education that's so necessary, but then using campaigns like that, like legal defense funds, like assisting local nonprofits with the services that they provide to these folks, particularly in border towns where we're seeing a huge need for it. We can use those as tactics to bring in more individuals and be able to use that as a strategy to create and implement really, I should say, effective community education.
We're out of time. That's a wrap. I'd like to thank and ask that you all join me in thanking our three wonderful panelists. There's a lot more excitement in store for today, so stay here.
Stay here.